Isn't it incredible to think that, well, beneath our feet lie the remnants of creatures that lived millions and millions of years ago?
It really is.
Today, we're going to unearth one such story, a paleontological adventure that unfolded right in the heart of South Africa.
We are indeed. We're taking a deep dive into Arcusaurus. It's an early Jurassic dinosaur, and its discovery gives us this fascinating peek into the early days of the sauropodomorphs.
Ah, yes, the plant eaters that eventually led to those giants, the huge, long-necked sauropods everyone pictures.
Exactly those.
We've got some really interesting stuff to look at today. Key bits from the scientific paper that first described Archosaurus and, some cool details about the discovery itself.
Mm.
So our mission really is to figure out what makes Archosaurus special. What does it tell us about this really crucial time in dinosaur evolution? And we want to do it without drowning you in jargon.
Sounds good.
Okay, so where does the Archosaurus story actually begin, like the physical place?
Right, so the first chapter, you could say, unfolded back in March 2006. The place is a site called Spion Kop Hielbo.
Spion Kop Hielbo, okay.
Yeah, and this spot is within the Upper Elliott Formation. That's near a town called Senekal in the Free State Province of South Africa. Geologically speaking, that layer, the Upper Elliott, is dated to the Pliensbachine age.
Which is early Jurassic.
That's right, early Jurassic period.
So picture this. It's 2006, paleontologists digging away in this ancient landscape. Who are the lucky people who actually found these bones?
The fossils themselves were discovered by Lucille Pereira and Fernando Abdallah.
Ah,
And actually, it's in recognition of their find that this species got its name, Parabdalorum.
oh, that's fantastic. A great way to honor their work.
Absolutely.
And who officially, gave this dinosaur its scientific name and introduced it to the world.
So the formal description, the naming of the genus Archosaurus and the species Parabdalorum, that happened in 2011. It was the work of paleontologists Adam Yates, Matthew Bonin, and Johan Neveling.
Okay. Now, Archosaurus, it sounds quite memorable. What's the story behind that name?
Yeah, Archosaurus. It comes from the Latin word arcus, which means rainbow.
Rainbow.
It's a really meaningful nod to the Rainbow Nation concept of South Africa,
Yeah.
Celebrating the country's diversity.
I love that connection. That's really neat. So, okay, back to the dig site. Kop Hielbo. What did they actually find? Was it like a whole skeleton just lying there?
No, not a complete skeleton. The holotype specimen, that's the main reference fossil for the species, BP16235, is a partial skull.
A partial skull, okay.
But, importantly, within a small area right around this skull, they found several other bones, all of a similar size. And by looking closely at the features, how they overlapped, the researchers could tell they belonged to the same kind of dinosaur.
But I thought I read something about evidence for more than one Archosaurus there.
That's right, you did. The key clue was finding two right nasal bones.
Two right nasals.
Yeah, the nasal is a bone in the skull, kind of behind the nostril. Since one dinosaur only has one right nasal bone, finding two immediately told them they had remains from at least two different Archosaurus individuals.
Gotcha.
So because of that, each bone found apart from that main partial skull was given its own separate ID number.
So it was like finding pieces of maybe 2 or 3 different jigsaw puzzles all mixed up together.
Precisely. Yeah, good analogy. All the bones they found, including those skull parts for the holotype, were disarticulated.
Disarticulated means?
Meaning they weren't connected in their original positions how they would have been in the living animal. They were scattered.
Right.
So the holotype itself includes that nasal bone, a postorbital bone that's from around the eye socket,
Okay.
a dentary, which is the main tooth-bearing bone in the lower jaw, another lower jaw bone called the coronoid, and some teeth still associated with the maxilla, the upper jaw bone.
Wow, quite a few skull bits.
Yes, and there's also a possible vertebra from the tail, a caudal vertebra, that might belong to that same holotype individual.
Okay. And apart from the holotype skull parts and that second nasal, what other specific Archosaurus bones turned up?
The additional finds included, well, that second right nasal we mentioned, another dentary bone, a premaxilla that's the bone right at the very front tip of the upper jaw,
Right at the front, yeah.
and a laterosphenoid, which is a bone that forms part of the brain case sort of on the side.
Now, the source material, it mentions these individuals were likely juveniles, young dinosaurs. What were the clues for that?
Well, two main things. First, the bones themselves were quite small overall.
Okay.
And second, the researchers observed open bone sutures. You could think of sutures as the sort of seams where different skull bones meet and fuse together.
Like in a baby's skull.
Exactly like that. In young animals, these seams are open and they fuse solid as the animal matures. The fact that these sutures were open in the Archosaurus fossils strongly suggested they weren't fully grown.
And crucially, they made sure these weren't just, say, baby Odonyx or young Massospondylus, other dinosaurs found in the area.
Yes, absolutely. That was a critical check. The paleontologists did a very detailed comparison. They looked at specific features on the Archosaurus bones and compared them directly with known juvenile specimens of Ardonyx and Massospondylus. And they found enough distinct, unique differences to confidently say, nope, these aren't just young versions of those other guys. These were definitely young Archosaurus.
Okay, so we have these intriguing bone fragments painting a picture of a small, young, early sauropodomorph. Now, the big question. Where does Archosaurus fit into the grand scheme of things, the huge dinosaur family tree?
Right, the initial phylogenetic study. And that's basically building that family tree, figuring out relationships. It placed Archosaurus as a very basal sauropodomorph. Basal here means it branched off quite early on, that evolutionary line leading towards the giant sauropods, one of the early members of the group.
And in that first analysis, who did they find was its closest relative, its sister taxon?
The study suggested that Archosaurus's closest relative, its sister taxon, was another dinosaur called Euphrasia.
Euphrasia? That name sounds familiar. Wasn't it from a much earlier time period?
Yeah.
Like, significantly earlier.
Exactly, yes. Euphrasia lived way back during the Norian stage of the late Triassic period.
Late Triassic. But Arcusaurus is early Jurassic.
Correct, which means there's a pretty significant time gap between them. We're talking millions and millions of years.
Okay, hang on. This is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? If Arcusaurus and Euphrasia are supposedly close relatives but live so far apart in time, what does that imply?
It implies the existence of something paleontologists call a ghost lineage.
A ghost lineage sounds spooky.
Huh. Well, maybe a little. Think of it like a missing branch on the evolutionary tree. It's a period where we infer this lineage must have existed and been evolving based on the relationships we see later, but we just haven't found the fossil evidence for it yet.
So it's a gap in the fossil record.
Exactly. In this case, that proposed close relationship between late Triassic Euphrasia and early Jurassic Archosaurus pointed to a potential gap of roughly 35 million years in the known Sauropodomorph fossil record.
35 million years. That's huge.
It's massive, especially during what we think was a really critical period for early Sauropodomorph evolution. So Archosaurus finding kind of hinted at this long, undocumented history.
A huge chunk of missing time. Wow. A lot of evolution could happen in 35 million years. But the story of where Archosaurus fits isn't totally cut and dried, is it? Weren't there some anatomical features that kind of clashed with that initial placement?
You're absolutely right. It wasn't straightforward. While that first analysis put Archosaurus in a very basal position close to Euphrasia, it also possessed several anatomical features, particularly in the skull, that are usually seen in more advanced sauropodomorphs.
More advanced? Like which ones?
Specifically, features typical of a group called Plateosauria. Think Plateosaurus itself.
Okay.
So this mix of seemingly early traits and these more derived later traits, it made researchers question that initial phylogenetic result. Is it really that basal, or does it belong somewhere else?
So Archosaurus isn't just another discovery. It's actually making us rethink some of the connections, some assumptions about how these early longnecks evolved.
Precisely. It's throwing a bit of a spanner in the works, in a good way. It highlights the complexity.
It's like Archosaurus is this mosaic showing a blend of old and new features, making it a fascinating evolutionary puzzle piece.
Let's dive into some of those specific anatomical features that stood out, especially focusing on the skull, since that's what they found most of for the holotype.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start right at the front, the snout. Based on the shape of the premaxilla, that bone at the very tip of the upper jaw, which is kind of squarish in Archosaurus, it's likely it had a relatively deep snout. That deep snout is actually a feature it shares with those more advanced plesiosaurians we just mentioned.
Interesting. Okay. And where were the nostrils located on this potentially deep snout?
The external nares, the nostril opening, seems to have been positioned quite close to the tick of the snout, pretty far forward.
And the eye socket, the orbit, anything special about its size or shape? Yeah, the orbit was proportionally quite large, actually, and fully circular in shape, which is interesting because it kind of resembles the eye socket of a much earlier, very basal dinosaur called Eoraptor.
Another mix of features. Okay, let's zoom in on the premaxilla itself, that frontmost bone. What made its structure so noteworthy?
Well, first off, each premaxilla held 4 teeth. But the really interesting bits were the interdental plates.
Interdental plates.
Yeah, these are small bony projections that sit between the tooth sockets. In Archosaurus, these plates were distinctly taller than they were wide. That's different from what you see in many other early saurischians the larger group dinosaurs belong to.
Taller than wide. Okay.
But even more unique were these two bony shelves that projected inwards on the inner side of each premaxilla, kind of one stacked above the other.
Two shelves inside the front of the upper jaw.
Exactly. Imagine the very front part of the roof of your mouth. Archosaurus seems to have had sort of a double-layered structure there, formed by these shelves projecting inwards from the premaxilla. That's quite unusual.
Wow, that does sound distinctive. How did these two shelves relate to each other?
So the lower shelves from the left and right premaxillae actually met in the middle. They contacted each other, forming the very front part of the palate, the roof of the mouth. And where they met, they enclosed a large sort of oval-shaped opening right at the front of the palate.
All right.
The upper shelf, though, the one above it, was less extensive. It didn't meet its partner from the other side in the middle. These double shells are considered autapomorphes, unique defining features of Archosaurus.
Very cool. Okay, moving just slightly back along the skull to the nasal bone, another piece of that holotype puzzle. What was its structure like?
Right, the nasal bone. It was basically a plate-like bone, and it had 4 bony extensions or processes sticking out from it.
4 extensions, okay.
2 of these pointed forward towards the snout tip. Together, these 2 processes formed the back half of the nostril opening. Now, the lower of these 2 forward-pointing processes had a distinctive shape. It was kind of tongue-shaped, wider than the upper one.
Tongue-shaped, how's that unusual?
Well, it's notable because in most related dinosaurs, that lower process tends to be more triangular. And interestingly, in Plateosaurians, those proportions are often reversed. The upper process is wider. So Archosaurus is doing its own thing there.
Okay, different again. And the other 2 processes of the nasal bone, they pointed backwards.
Yes, towards the back of the skull. The upper one, the inner one, was broad and flat. It likely connected to the frontal bone, which sits behind it on the skull roof, with a fairly straight connection, a straight suture.
And the lower one?
The lower outer rearward pointing process extended back to contact the lacrimal bone, that's the bone forming the front edge of the eye socket. And just in front of where it meets the lacrimal, on the outer edge of the nasal, there was this little hook-like projection sticking out.
Fascinating little details. Was there anything else unusual about the nasal bones when you look at the skull roof as a whole?
Yes, actually. When viewed from above, there was a single large elliptical opening, a foramen, that penetrated both the left and right nasal bones, right on the midline of the skull.
An opening going through both nasals.
Yeah, right down the middle. It's a feature that's also seen in another early sauropodomorph, a larger one called Melanorosaurus. So maybe some shared ancestry or function there.
Intriguing. Let's shift focus slightly again to the postorbital bone, the one forming the back part of the eye socket rim. What were its key characteristics in Archosaurus?
Okay, the postorbital. It forms that upper rear corner of the eye socket. It had 3 main projections, or processes. Yeah. One pointing forward towards the eye, one pointing down behind the eye, and one pointing backward along the side of the skull.
All right.
Now, the forward-pointing one was about the same length as the downward-pointing one. And interestingly, when you look at it from above, that forward process was straight. It didn't curve inwards toward the midline of the skull, which is actually more typical for many other early sauropodomorphs.
So, another deviation from the norm. What about that smaller 4th projection that was mentioned in the description?
Ah, yes. That's a really unique one. There was a smaller 4th process that was directed upwards and inwards, towards the top and center of the skull.
Upwards and inwards.
Yeah. This process would have articulated, connected with the parietal bone, which is one of the main bones at the very back of the skull roof. The orientation of this particular process, pointing up and in like that, is described as being pretty unique among dinosaurs generally.
Wow, a truly unique feature then. And the main rearward pointing process of the postorbital, the one going back along the skull, was that unusual too?
It was, yes. In most other basal sauropodomorphs, that rearward process tends to taper, to get narrower towards its tip. But in Archosaurus, the tip of this process was actually bifurcated.
Bifurcated meaning?
Meaning it was forked, or split into 2 small branches at the very end, another little distinguishing feature.
Man, it really sounds like the skull of Archosaurus, even though it's partial, is just packed with unique anatomical information. Hints of a really complex evolutionary story.
Absolutely. And, even the other bones they found, that dentary and coronoid from the lower jaw, the maxillary teeth, that later sphenoid fragment from the brain case, they all add pieces to the puzzle, helping us build a picture of this really intriguing early dinosaur.
So let's try and bring this all together then. What are the main things we should really take away from this deep dive into Archosaurus?
Okay, well, first, the discovery itself in South Africa gives us this really valuable snapshot of an early sauropodomorph from the early Jurassic, a critical time period.
Right.
Second, what's so fascinating is its anatomy. It shows this mosaic, this mix of features. Some seem quite primitive, like you'd expect in an early form, but others are more characteristic of the later, more derived Plesiosauria.
That blend of traits.
Exactly. And that blend makes it, well, a bit tricky to place definitively in the Sauropodomorph family tree. It really challenges our understanding of the evolutionary steps and relationships within this important dinosaur group. And of course, those very unique skull features we talked about, the double premaxillary shelves, the specific shapes of the nasal and post-orbital processes, they really make Archosaurus stand out.
And it's not just about its unique mix of features, but also about when it lived, connecting back to that potential ghost lineage idea, right?
Precisely. That initial phylogenetic hypothesis, linking it closely with the much older late Triassic Euphrasia, highlighted that enormous gap in the fossil record, that 35 million year stretch where we have frustratingly little fossil evidence showing how sauropodomorphs were evolving. So even though its exact placement is still debated, partly because of its mixed features, the very existence of Archosaurus in the early Jurassic underscores how important that time was for the origins and the diversification of the lineage that would eventually lead to the giant sauropods.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? If Archosaurus, with this strange and revealing combination of features, was roaming South Africa back then, what other secrets might the rocks from that time in that region still hold?
Exactly. What other transitional forms might be out there waiting to be discovered? Forms that could shed even more light on that path towards the giants.
It's just a powerful reminder that our picture of dinosaur evolution is never really finished, is it? It's constantly being redrawn, refined with every new fossil unearthed. Thanks for taking that deep dive with me.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating animal.